Welcome to the second sleep story episode in our special St. Patrick's Day series. Tonight's podcast from the Sleepy Tales of Lore channel is titled 3 Coins of Flannery Moss. It concerns a trickster leprechaun with a warm heart. My name is Declan, and Elle will narrate tonight's story in a calm, soothing voice that will practically hypnotize you into a deep sleep quickly. While our stories are fun and the artwork beautiful, the way you can derive the greatest benefit from them is to crawl into bed, get comfy and relax while you close your eyes and start listening to our hypnotic stories, then letting go and drifting off to sleep as soon as you feel like it, feeling refreshed upon awakening. You can play it in a loop so that if you get up for a bathroom break, you can go right back to where you left off. Or you can watch it from our podcast playlist and be taken to the next story for an all-night narration experience. Now get ready and settle in as our story begins. Now there are roads in Ireland, and anyone who has walked the country roads of Connaught on a long autumn afternoon will know the ones I mean, that seem as you travel them to be going somewhere entirely reasonable, and then, without any announcement or apology, begin to go somewhere else. Not lost exactly, not wrong, simply other. As if the road itself has its own opinions about where things ought to end up, and has decided on this particular afternoon to act on them. The road on which Cormac Doyle found himself on a Tuesday in mid-October, with a cart full of assorted goods behind him, bolts of wool cloth and 3 dozen candles and 2 rather elderly hams and a quantity of brass buttons, was precisely that kind of road. He had set out from Ballinasloe that morning with the clear and sensible intention of reaching Tuam by nightfall. He had maps. He had experience. He had 31 years of travelling the roads of Connaught, and a horse named Mossy who had been making this general journey for 12 of those years, and had strong opinions about the correct route. And yet, here he was, on a road he did not recognise, between hedgerows of a height and density he was quite certain he had never encountered before, with the sun going down at an angle that suggested he had somehow turned himself completely around without noticing. Mossy, for his part, appeared entirely untroubled by this development, which Cormac found either reassuring or deeply suspicious. Cormac Doyle was, it should be said at the outset, not a stupid man. He was, in fact, considerably smarter than most people he encountered gave him credit for, which was itself a form of intelligence. He was tall and lean and weathered in the manner of a man who has spent most of his life outdoors, and he had eyes of that particular Irish grey-green that looked in certain lights like they were calculating something, which they usually were. He was also, and this will become relevant, a man of considerable greed. Not monstrous greed, not the kind that makes a man villainous or cruel. Simply the ordinary working greed of a merchant who has spent 31 years buying things cheaply and selling them at a profit, and who has developed over those 31 years a very highly tuned instinct for opportunity. The hedgerows on either side of the road were old, very old. The kind of old that Irish hedgerows achieve when they have been left entirely alone for long enough to become something closer to walls. Hawthorn and blackthorn and elder all wound together in a mass so dense and so deeply established that you could not have pushed a hand through it without considerable difficulty and a fair amount of blood. The leaves were turning in every shade of autumn: amber and russet, and the deep, almost black red of old hawthorn berries, and the whole of it in the low, slanting October light was beautiful. Cormac, being Cormac, noticed the beauty, and then immediately began trying to calculate whether there was any money in it. He had just arrived at the conclusion that there probably wasn't, when Morsi, without any instruction, stopped. Cormac looked up from his calculations. He looked at Mossy. He looked at the road ahead. He looked at the hedgerow to his left. And then he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Small, rhythmic, and coming from somewhere beyond the hedgerow in a field he could not see. Cormac Doyle, 31 years a merchant, knew exactly what that sound was. Every man and woman in Connaught knew exactly what that sound was. His grey-green eyes went very, very sharp. And the highly tuned instinct for opportunity that had served him so well for 31 years began to sing. Now Flannery Moss, for that was his name, and he wore it as he wore most things with considerable satisfaction, was sitting on a flat stone at the edge of a field that belonged technically to a farmer named Hennigan, who had not been in it since August, and who would not, in Flannery's considerable experience, be in it again before spring, which suited Flannery very well. He was, by any measure, a fine specimen of a leprechaun. Not large, leprechauns are not large, but present, solidly and thoroughly present in the way of someone who takes up considerably more room than their physical dimensions would suggest. His coat was green, in the specific and unapologetic shade of someone who has been wearing green their entire life and has never once considered wearing anything else. His beard was red, the deep, thoroughly Irish red of autumn bracken, or old copper, or the coat of a well-fed fox on a bright morning. His hat sat on his head at an angle that suggested it had arrived there by negotiation rather than design. And his eyes were the problem. They were bright. Not bright in the way of someone who is merely happy, or bright in the way of someone who is merely clever, though Flannery was both of those things in considerable measure. They were bright in the way of someone who finds the world deeply, continuously, and inexhaustibly amusing. The way of someone who woke each morning with the settled expectation that the day ahead would provide at least one genuinely excellent laugh. He had been in the world a very long time, long enough to have refined the art of being a leprechaun to something approaching perfection, long enough to know every trick that a human being was likely to try on a leprechaun, and to have developed for each one a counter so elegant and so thoroughly humiliating that most of the people who had tried them on their way home afterward, had found themselves laughing despite themselves. This was Flannery's particular gift. Not cruelty, never cruelty, but a mischief so perfectly calibrated to the particular weaknesses of the particular person in front of him that it arrived not as punishment, but as revelation. A very funny revelation. He was currently working on a shoe. The shoe was his own, the left one specifically, which had developed a squeak sometime around the previous March, and had, despite his considerable skill, resisted all efforts at correction. It was the one thing about himself that Flannery Moss found genuinely annoying. He had the shoe off his foot and propped on his knee, and he was working at the sole with a small, precise hammer in the last of the October light, his red beard catching the low sun, his hat at its negotiated angle, and his bright, amused eyes fixed, apparently, on his work. Apparently, on his work. Because Flannery Moss had heard the cart stop on the road beyond the hedgerow approximately 4 minutes ago, and he had heard the particular quality of the silence that followed. The silence of someone listening and calculating. He knew that silence very well. His hammer continued its rhythm without the smallest interruption. Tap, tap, tap. And at the very corners of his bright, amused eyes, the smallest, most private smile began to form. Now, the gap in the hedgerow, when Cormac finally found it, was not the kind of gap that announces itself. It was the kind of gap that exists only because something small and determined had been using it for a very long time and had worn it, just barely, into being. A gap for a fox, perhaps, or a badger, or something considerably smaller than a travelling merchant of 31 years' experience. Cormac looked at the gap. He looked at his coat, which was his good coat, his travelling coat, and the one he wore when he wanted to make a solid impression on people he was about to sell things to. He looked back at the gap. The tapping continued, patient and rhythmic, from somewhere on the other side. Cormac took off his good coat, folded it with the care of a man who knows exactly what things cost, placed it on the car, and went through the gap. It cost him a button, a considerable amount of dignity, and a long scratch down his left forearm that would bother him for a week. He emerged on the other side into Hennigan's field, breathing somewhat harder than he would have liked, with hawthorn in his hair and an expression on his face that he immediately rearranged into something more composed. The field was beautiful in the way that neglected Irish fields in October are beautiful, long grass gone to seed and silver in the low light, and mushrooms in pale rings near the far wall, and the smell of cold earth and turned leaves and something else something older and sweeter that Cormac could not have named and did not try to. And there, on a flat stone at the field's edge, not 20 feet from where Cormac stood, was Flannery Moss, working with complete and undisturbed concentration on his shoe. Cormac looked at him. He took in the green coat, the red beard, the hat at its improbable angle, the small precise hammer rising and falling with that steady rhythm. He took in the leather satchel on the ground beside the flat stone, and the dull gleam of something metal at its open mouth, and his grey-green eyes went, if possible, even sharper than before. He began very carefully, very quietly, to move toward Flannery across the long grass. Now, it is important to understand that the traditional method of catching a leprechaun, as every person in Connaught knew, was to keep your eyes fixed on him without blinking from the moment you first saw him to the moment you had him in your grasp. Because the moment you looked away, even for the smallest fraction of a second, he would be gone, vanished as completely as if he had never been there at all. Cormac knew this. He had known it since he was 6 years old, and his grandmother had told him, with the absolute authority of someone passing on information of the highest practical importance. He fixed his grey-green eyes on Flannery Moss. He did not blink. He moved through the long grass, one slow, careful step at a time, his eyes locked unwaveringly on that red beard and that green coat and that steadily tapping hammer. Flannery, for his part, continued to work. He did not look up. He did not appear to notice the large weathered merchant making his very careful way across Hennigan's field toward him, eyes wide and unblinking with the intense, focused expression of a man attempting something he considers extremely clever. 10 feet, 5 feet, 3. Cormac, barely breathing, reached out his right hand and placed it firmly on Flannery Moss's left shoulder. Flannery slowly set his hammer down on the flat stone beside him. He turned his head with the unhurried ease of a man who has been expecting this and looked up at Cormac. Those bright, amused eyes met Cormac's grey-green ones, and Flannery Moss, the most mischievous leprechaun in the whole of County Galway, smiled. Not the smile of someone who has been caught. The smile of someone who has been waiting. "Well now," said Flannery Moss, in a voice like turf smoke and old honey and the particular satisfaction of a man who has just seen exactly the thing he was hoping to see. "Took you long enough." Cormac blinked, which, as it turned out, was the first of his mistakes. Now, the fact that Flannery had not vanished despite Cormac's blink was the first thing that should have told Cormac something. The second thing that should have told him something was the smile. And the third thing, which should frankly have told him everything, was the way Flannery settled himself more comfortably on his flat stone, crossed one small booted foot over the other, and looked up at Cormac with the relaxed and pleasurable expression of a man who has just sat down to his favourite meal. Cormac noticed none of these things. Or rather, he noticed them and arrived at entirely the wrong conclusions about all of them. He concluded that Flannery had not vanished because he, Cormac, had been too quick for him. He concluded that the smile was bravado, and he concluded that the comfortable settling on the stone was resignation. He was, in all three conclusions, completely wrong. But he did not know that yet. "Right then," said Cormac, in the brisk tone of a man conducting a transaction he considers already settled. "I have you fairly caught, and you know the rules as well as I do, so let us not waste each other's time." He paused to let the weight of this land, and then added, with what he imagined was a winning smile, "I want your gold." Flannery looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked down at his shoe, then back up at Cormac. Then, with the air of someone performing a very small and necessary courtesy, he reached down to his leather satchel, opened it, and produced 3 coins. He set them on the flat stone between them, one by one by one. They were extraordinary coins. Even in the low October light, they caught and held the last of the sun in a way that ordinary gold simply does not. They glowed from within, the way embers glow when you blow on them. Deep and rich and alive. Each one was the size of Cormac's thumbnail, perfectly round and stamped on its face with a pattern he could not quite make out, that seemed to shift and change each time he looked at it directly. Cormac stared at them. His highly tuned instinct for opportunity was practically singing now. 3 coins, said Flannery pleasantly, is what I have on me tonight. He folded his small hands in his lap and looked up at Cormac with those bright, amused eyes. Now, you could take them. He said it the way you might say, you could have the last slice of bread. Perfectly pleasant. Perfectly neutral. I could, said Cormac, whose hand was already moving toward the coins. Or, said Flannery, and the single word landed in the air between them with a precision that made Cormac's hand stop. You could play for them. Cormac looked at him. Play, he repeated. 3 rounds, said Flannery, as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. 1 coin at stake per round, my game of choosing, and if you win all 3, you may take not just these 3 coins. but every coin in my hoard. The word hoard landed on Cormac Doyle like warm sunshine on a cold morning. "And if I lose a round?" he asked, with the careful tone of a man who has no intention of losing anything, but likes to know the terms. "If you lose a round," said Flannery cheerfully, "I keep that round's coin, and we play on." He paused. Simple enough, even for a merchant. Cormac considered this. He was, as we have established, not a stupid man. And some small and sensible part of him, the part that had kept him alive and solvent through 31 years of roads and rain and difficult customers, was sending up a signal. A small, insistent, uncomfortable signal. The signal said, "This is too easy." Cormac, being Cormac, looked at the 3 glowing coins on the flat stone and ignored it. "Done," he said. Flannery picked up the first coin, held it up between his finger and thumb so that it caught the last sliver of the October sun, and smiled the smile of a man for whom the evening has just become considerably more entertaining. "Round 1, he said, "is a question." "A question," Cormac repeated with the confidence of someone who has answered a great many questions in his time and found most of them straightforward. "One question," said Flannery pleasantly, "that you must answer truthfully and completely before I am satisfied." He turned the coin once between his fingers. "The question is this." He looked up at Cormac with those bright and entirely merciless eyes. "What," said Flannery Moss, "is the one thing you have never been able to sell?" The field was very quiet. Somewhere in the hedgerow, a blackbird made a sound, and then thought better of it. Cormac Doyle, 31 years a merchant, opened his mouth, and for the first time in a very long time, found that he had absolutely nothing to say. Now, Cormac Doyle had, in his 31 years as a merchant, sold a remarkable variety of things. He had sold wool and linen and leather and brass. He had sold candles to people who had plenty of light, and turf to people who had plenty of fire. And on one memorable occasion, a rather ornate bird cage, to a woman in Roscommon who did not own a bird, and had, as far as he could tell, no intention of acquiring one. He'd sold things that were useful, and things that were beautiful, and things that were neither, and he had never, in 31 years, come away from a transaction entirely empty-handed. He was, in short, a man who believed, with a deep and practiced certainty, that everything had a price, and that if you knew the price, you could sell the thing. And yet, the question sat in front of him, as solid and immovable as the flat stone Flannery was sitting on, and the more Cormac turned it over in his grey-green calculating mind, the more uncomfortable it became. Because there was something. There had always been something. Something he had carried with him through 31 years of roads and rain and transactions, like a stone in his boot that he had simply learned to walk with. Something he had attempted, on more occasions than he would ever have admitted, to convert into profit, and had failed every single time. He looked at Flannery. Flannery looked back at him with those bright, patient eyes and said nothing. "Time," said Cormac, finally. Flannery tilted his head the way a bird tilts its head when it is deciding whether what it has just heard is worth investigating further. "Explain," he said. Cormac shifted his weight from one foot to the other, which was, for a man of his composure, as close to squirming as he was likely to get. "I have tried more times than I can count to make time work for me the way everything else works for me." He paused. "To get more of it, or spend less of it, or find some way to trade it for something better." He looked at his own hands for a moment, those weathered, capable merchant's hands, and then back at Flannery. "And I never could." Flannery regarded him for a long and thoughtful moment. "That," he said, "is an answer." He turned the first coin once between his fingers. "But it is not a complete answer." Cormac frowned. "I answered the question." "You answered half the question," said Flannery pleasantly. "You told me the thing you cannot sell." He held the coin up so that it caught what remained of the October light. "You did not tell me why." The field was quiet again. Cormac looked at the coin. He looked at Flannery. He looked briefly at the hedgerow, as if measuring the distance back to the road, and then appeared to decide, with the pragmatism of a man who has come too far to retreat, to continue. "Because," he said, and then stopped. Started again. "Because," he said more slowly, "time is the one thing that does not care what you are willing to pay for it." He said it the way a man says something he has known for a long time but has never before put into words. "It goes, regardless." He paused. "I've spent 31 years being very good at getting things to go the way I want them to go." His voice, for just a moment, had something in it that was not quite the voice of a merchant at all. Time never got that message. Flannery looked at him for a long moment with those bright eyes, and in them, just briefly, was something that was not quite amusement and not quite sympathy, but somewhere in the interesting country between the two. Then he set the first coin down on the flat stone and slid it deliberately toward Cormac. "That," said Flannery Moss, "is a complete answer." He picked up the second coin, held it up, and those bright eyes returned to their default state of gleaming mischief. "Round 2, he said, "is a task." Cormac, who had just won a leprechaun's gold coin through the uncomfortable experience of saying something true, picked up the first coin with fingers that were not quite steady. It was warm in his hand, warmer than it should have been, given the October air. Warm the way a coal is warm, long after the fire has gone. He closed his fingers around it. "A task," he repeated, with rather less confidence than he had managed for the question. "A simple task," said Flannery in the tone of a man for whom the word simple covers a great deal of ground. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a length of rope approximately 3 feet long. He held it out to Cormac. "Make it longer," he said without adding anything to it. Cormac took the rope. He looked at it. He looked at Flannery. He looked back at the rope. And the small, insistent, uncomfortable signal that he had ignored earlier began once again to make itself heard. Cormac Doyle stood in Hennigan's field in the last of the October light, holding a 3-foot length of rope and thinking. He was, it must be said, a man who was good at thinking. 31 years of commerce had given him a mind that moved quickly and practically through problems, identifying the shape of a thing, the weak point of a thing, the angle from which a thing was most likely to yield. He had untangled bad debts and difficult customers, and on one occasion, a genuinely complicated situation involving 2 brothers, a disputed inheritance, and a consignment of missing cheese that had taken him the better part of a fortnight to resolve. He was not, in short, a man who was easily defeated by problems. He looked at the rope. Make it longer without adding anything to it. He turned it over in his hands. It was ordinary rope, rough and slightly damp from the October air, with no particular distinguishing features, and absolutely no inclination, as far as he could tell, to become longer. His mind moved through the possibilities with the brisk efficiency of a merchant taking inventory. He could stretch it, but rope of this kind would not stretch appreciably. And besides, Flannery was watching him with those bright eyes, and something told him that stretching would not be considered acceptable. He could unravel it, but that would make it thinner and longer only in the most technical sense. And he suspected Flannery's definition of longer was rather more rigorous than technical. He turned the rope over again. Flannery, on his flat stone, had picked up his hammer again and resumed his tapping with the air of a man who has all the time in the world and finds it entirely well spent. Tap, tap, tap. Cormac paced 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, which was all Hennigan's field conveniently offered in his immediate vicinity, still turning the rope in his hands. Make it longer without adding anything to it. He stopped pacing. He looked at the rope with the expression of a man who has just heard, from a very great distance, the faint but unmistakable sound of an idea approaching. He looked at Flannery. Flannery, tapping his shoe, did not look up. Cormac looked back at the rope. He took one end in his left hand and one end in his right, and he pulled. Not hard, not in the way of someone trying to stretch it, but with a slow and deliberate tension, the way you pull a thing when you want to understand its nature rather than change it. The rope, as expected, did not stretch. Cormac frowned. Then, slowly, he began to unwind it. Not all of it, just the last 2 inches at one end, carefully separating the 3 strands that made up the rope's construction, laying them out with the patience of a man who is not entirely sure where he is going, but is following the thread anyway. He looked at the 3 separated strands. He looked at the rope. And then, with a sudden completeness, the idea arrived. He wound the 3 separated strands back together, but this time more loosely, with a wider weave, so that the same length of fibre occupied more space. He held up the rope. It was fractionally longer than it had been. Not much, perhaps half an inch, but longer, genuinely longer, using only what was already there. He held it out to Flannery, with the slightly triumphant expression of a man who has just solved something he was not entirely sure he could solve. Flannery set his hammer down. He took the rope, examined it, turned it over in his small, capable hands, held it up against the sky, and looked at it for a long and entirely unreadable moment. Cormac waited. Flannery lowered the rope. He looked at Cormac with those bright eyes, and in them was the same expression that had been there at the end of round 1, that interesting country between amusement and something warmer. "That," said Flannery, "is not the answer I expected." "Is it the right answer?" said Cormac. Flannery considered this for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to make Cormac's confident expression begin very slightly to waver. "It is a right answer," said Flannery, and slid the second coin across the flat stone toward Cormac. Cormac picked it up and it was warm in his hand as the first had been, and the triumphant expression returned, stronger now and considerably less becoming. 2 coins. 1 round remaining. And on the other side of this last round, the entire hoard of Flannery moss. Cormac looked at the 3rd coin, still sitting on the flat stone between them, and then at Flannery, and the grey-green eyes were very sharp indeed, and the instinct for opportunity was no longer singing. It was practically shouting. Flannery picked up the 3rd coin. He held it up, and the last of the October light caught it, and it glowed deep and rich and alive as the others had glowed. "Round 3, said Flannery Moss, and his voice had in it, now, a quality that had not been there before. Not less amused, but beneath the amusement, something more deliberate, more considered. The quality of a man who has been playing a game and is now arriving at the part of the game that matters. Round 3, he said, is a choice. Now the word choice is a word that Cormac Doyle liked very much. It was, in his considerable experience, one of the most useful words in the language of commerce. Because a choice, properly constructed, was never really a choice at all. It was a direction, dressed up in the clothing of freedom, so that the person being directed arrived at the destination you had already chosen for them, feeling entirely that it had been their own idea. Cormac had been constructing choices of this kind for 31 years. He was, he would have said, without any false modesty, exceptionally good at it. He was therefore, when Flannery said the word, immediately and thoroughly interested. A choice, he said, leaning forward slightly, with the alert expression of a man who believes he is about to identify the mechanism of a trick before the trick is performed. A choice, confirmed Flannery, turning the 3rd coin between his fingers in that slow and deliberate way. I'm going to offer you 2 things. He held up one finger. The first thing is this coin, here, now, in your hand. No conditions, no complications. Yours. He held up a second finger. The second thing is every coin in my hoard, which is considerable, delivered to you 1 month from tonight, at this exact spot. He set the 3rd coin back down on the flat stone and folded his small hands in his lap and looked up at Cormac with those bright and entirely patient eyes. That is the choice, he said pleasantly. Cormac looked at the coin on the stone. He looked at Flannery. He looked back at the coin. His mind, that quick and practical mind, moved through the problem with its usual brisk efficiency. 1 coin now, or an entire hoard in a month. He already had 2 coins warm in his pocket, coins that glowed like embers and were worth, he was quite certain, more than anything he had ever traded in 31 years. A third coin of the same kind would be extraordinary. But an entire hoard. He looked at Flannery. How considerable is considerable? Flannery smiled. Considerable enough that you would never need to sell another button or another ham or another candle for the rest of your life. The instinct for opportunity which had been shouting went very, very quiet. The quiet of something listening so hard it had forgotten to make noise. Now here is where Cormac should have stopped. Here is where the small and sensible part of him that had been sending up signals all evening should have been given the floor and listened to, with the full and respectful attention it deserved. Because the question, the obvious question, the question that any sensible person would have asked immediately, was this. Why would a leprechaun who did not have to offer anything, and who had in fact already lost 2 coins, offer to give away his entire hoard for nothing more than a month's wait? It was, on its face, an extraordinarily generous offer. And Cormac Doyle, 31 years a merchant, knew better than almost anyone that extraordinarily generous offers were never what they appeared to be. He knew this. He looked at the coin on the stone. He looked at Flannery, sitting there with those bright, patient eyes and that red beard catching the last of the October light, small and entirely comfortable and not, in any way that Cormac could identify, concerned. He thought about the word considerable. He thought about never selling another button. And the small, sensible part of him retreated to wherever small, sensible parts go when they have been overruled by greed. The hoard, said Cormac Doyle. Flannery picked up the 3rd coin and held it out to Cormac. Cormac blinked. But I chose the hoard. You did, said Flannery, in the tone of a man confirming something perfectly pleasant, perfectly simple, and so you do not get the coin. He turned it once between his fingers and placed it carefully back in his leather satchel. Cormac stared at him. That was the choice, said Flannery, with a smile of such serene and comprehensive satisfaction that Cormac felt, in some deep and wordless part of himself, that he had just missed something. Something large. Something that had been sitting in plain sight for the entire evening, waiting to be seen. I won the first 2 rounds, said Cormac slowly, and you are telling me I have lost the third. You chose the hoard over the coin, said Flannery cheerfully, which means you lost the coin, which means I keep it, which means you have won 2 out of 3. He tilted his head with the air of a mathematics teacher confirming a sum, which means you do not get the hoard. The field was very quiet. To get the hoard, said Flannery helpfully, you needed to win all 3 rounds. He paused just long enough. You won 2. Cormac Doyle stood in Hennigan's field in the gathering dark with 2 warm coins in his pocket and the elaborate and entirely personal sensation of a man who has been thoroughly outplayed settling over him like the October mist from the ground up. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He looked at Flannery, who was looking back at him with those bright, amused eyes and the smile of a man who has just delivered the punchline of a joke he has been constructing for the entire evening. And then, despite himself, despite 31 years of professional dignity, despite the loss of an entire leprechaun's horde, despite everything, Cormac Doyle Echo began to laugh. Now it should be said that Cormac Doyle's laugh was not a small thing. It was not the polite laugh of a man making the best of a bad situation, or the thin laugh of someone laughing so they do not have to do something worse. It was a real laugh, the kind that starts somewhere below the ribs and arrives in the world, without asking anyone's permission, large and unruly and entirely genuine. It was, in 31 years, the laugh of a man who had not, in 31 years, lost anything quite so completely, quite so elegantly, and quite so thoroughly at his own expense. He laughed until his eyes watered. He laughed until Mossy, on the other side of the hedgerow, shifted in his harness with the mild concern of a horse who is used to his person and finds this somewhat out of character. He laughed until the blackbird in the hedgerow, who had thought better of making noise earlier, apparently reconsidered and joined in with a long and indignant alarm call that made Cormac laugh harder still. Flannery watched all of this from his flat stone with an expression that had shifted in the space of that laugh, from the satisfied smile of a man who has delivered his punchline to something rather more attentive. He was, it must be said, not entirely used to this. He was used to a great many responses to the conclusion of his games. He was used to outrage, which was common, and bluster, which was even more common, and the particular tight-lipped silence of a man who is too proud to admit he has been bested, which was the most common of all. He had, on rare occasions, encountered genuine good humour, but usually the thin and slightly forced variety, the kind that a person puts on like a coat, over something colder underneath. This was different. This was the laugh of a man who found, genuinely and without reservation, that he had been beaten by something better than him, and who found that, on reflection rather than diminishing, the evening had been enormously improved by it. Flannery tilted his head. Cormac finally got his laugh under control, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and looked at Flannery with an expression that was still amused, but underneath the amusement, something else. Something that had not been there at the beginning of the evening, when he had been calculating the distance across Hennigan's field, with his eyes fixed and his hand reaching. Something that looked rather like respect. That, said Cormac, with the directness of a man who has just had something demonstrated to him rather forcefully and has decided to acknowledge it, was the cleverest thing I have ever had done to me. Flannery regarded him for a moment. You set it up from the beginning, said Cormac, working through it now, with the same quick, practical mind that had failed to work through it at the time. The question and the task, you made them winnable. So I would win them. So I would want the hoard. So that when you offered me the choice between the coin and the hoard, I would take the hoard and lose the third round and not get either. Flannery said nothing. The hoard doesn't exist, does it? Said Cormac. It was not quite a question. Flannery smiled. Now that, he said, would be telling. Cormac looked at him and then laughed again, shorter this time, but just as genuine. Either way, I have 2 of your coins, which is 2 more than I arrived with, and rather more than I deserve, given the performance I put in. He patted his coat pocket where the 2 warm coins sat, glowing their quiet ember glow against his ribs. Flannery was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet when he was thinking about something, with his red beard catching the last faint trace of the evening light, and his hammer resting still in his hand, and his bright eyes, for once, not amused exactly, but considering. In 31 years, said Flannery slowly, you are the 4th person to catch me fairly. Cormac waited. You are the first one to laugh. The field held this information for a moment in its quiet October dark. The others, said Cormac. What did they do? The first one argued for 2 hours and went home with nothing because he could not stop insisting that he had won something he hadn't. Flannery ticked them off on his fingers with the air of a man recounting mildly interesting historical footnotes. "The second one," cried, "which I found uncomfortable for everyone involved." He paused. "The third one sat down on the ground, right there." He pointed to a spot in the long grass approximately 4 feet from Cormac, and refused to move for the better part of an afternoon, on the grounds that, if he stayed long enough, I would eventually feel guilty. "Did you?" said Cormac. "I am a leprechaun," said Flannery, with dignity, "not a priest." Cormac laughed again, and this time Flannery laughed too. Not the private smile he had been wearing all evening, but a real laugh, smaller than Cormac's, but genuine and warm, and carrying in it the particular pleasure of a man who spends a great deal of his time being cleverer than everyone around him, and has just, unexpectedly, found someone worth being clever with. The October dark had settled fully around them now. The field was silver black in the starlight. From the road beyond the hedgerow, mossy shifted and blew in the patient way of a horse who has opinions about the lateness of the hour. Flannery picked up his shoe, examined the sole, gave it one final considered tap with his hammer, and put it back on his foot. Then he looked up at Cormac, and in those bright eyes was an expression that Cormac had not seen in them before. Not mischief, not amusement, not the satisfied gleam of a man who has just won a game. Something quieter than all of those, and considerably more interesting. "Sit down, Cormac Doyle," said Flannery Moss, "and I will tell you something worth considerably more than a hoard of gold." Cormac looked at him. He looked at the flat stone. He looked briefly in the direction of the road where Mossy and Tuam and the perfectly sensible remainder of his evening were waiting. And then he sat down in the long October grass beside the flat stone and looked at Flannery Moss and waited. Now Flannery Moss, in all his long years of outwitting merchants and farmers and the occasional overconfident schoolteacher, had never once sat in a field after dark and talked. Not because he had nothing to say. He had, as the evening had demonstrated, a very great deal to say, and the considerable gift of saying it at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right way, to produce precisely the effect he intended. But talking, the kind of talking that was not a game, not a trick, not a beautifully constructed sequence of moves designed to arrive at a predetermined conclusion, that kind of talking was something Flannery did rarely. He sat for a moment in the way he sat when he was deciding something, red beard still, hammer resting quiet in his hand, bright eyes looking not at Cormac, but at some middle distance, somewhere between the field and the stars. Then he began. I have been in this field, or fields very like it, he said, for longer than you would find comfortable to think about. He paused, not for effect, but in the way of someone choosing words with genuine care, rather than theatrical precision. And in that time, I have seen a very great many men come through gaps in hedgerows, with their eyes fixed and their hands reaching, and their minds full of gold. Cormac, sitting in the long grass, said nothing. Most of them, said Flannery, got nothing. He turned his hammer once in his hand. Not because I am cruel, I am not cruel, but because what they came for was not what they needed, and I have never seen the sense in giving a man what he wants, when what he wants will not help him. He looked at Cormac directly for a moment. You came for gold, he said. I did, said Cormac, without apology, because he was, in most things, an honest man, and in this field, on this evening, he found himself, for reasons he could not entirely account for, more honest than usual. And you have 2 coins, said Flannery, which are worth more than you yet understand, and less than you currently imagine. He paused. That is, by the way, true of most things worth having. The field breathed around them, the long grass moving in some unfelt current of air, the stars very bright above the dark shapes of the hedgerows. What I am going to tell you, said Flannery, is something that I have told no one. He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that is simply true. Not because it is a secret exactly, but because no one before tonight was in a position to hear it. Cormac waited. The October night waited with him. The coins, said Flannery, are not what most people think leprechaun gold is. He looked down at the leather satchel beside the flat stone. Most people think it is wealth, the kind you count and store and spend. He shook his head slowly once. It is not that kind of wealth. What kind is it? Said Cormac. Flannery looked at him for a long moment. The first coin, he said, you won by saying something true that you had never said aloud before. He paused. That coin will remind you, every time you hold it, of that truth. He turned his hammer in his hand. It will not make you rich, but it will make you honest in the one place where you were not before tonight. Cormac thought, without meaning to, of time. Of all the years he had spent trying to outrun it, outsmart it, turn it into something that would hold still long enough to be sold, and of the strange lightness that had come with saying so out loud to a leprechaun in a field in October. the second coin," said Flannery. "You won by finding a solution that was already inside the problem." He looked at Cormac steadily. "That coin will remind you, every time you hold it, that the answer to most things is already there, in what you have, if you look at it differently." The field was very quiet. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, low and clear, and was answered by nothing, and called again, and was content. Cormac sat with this in the way you sit with something that is settling into you, slowly and completely, the way warmth settles into cold hands. "And the third coin," he said quietly. "The third coin," said Flannery, and his voice was quieter now too. "You did not win." He looked at Cormac, and in those bright eyes was something, steady and direct and entirely without unkindness. Because the third coin was the one that would have taught you that enough is enough. He paused. "And you could not win that one tonight because you did not yet believe it." The October night received this with the silence it deserved. Cormac looked at his hands, resting on his knees in the long grass, those weathered, capable hands that had counted coins and calculated margins and reached always for the next thing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that. "Will I ever?" he said. And there was, in those 3 words, a quality that had nothing to do with commerce, and everything to do with the question that had been sitting quietly beneath every transaction of 31 years, waiting for a field and a flat stone and a red-bearded leprechaun to give it room. Flannery looked at him for a long, considered moment. "You laughed," he said simply. Cormac looked at him. "A man who can lose well," said Flannery Moss, "is already closer to enough than he thinks." The field breathed. The stars turned their slow and ancient turn overhead. Cormac Doyle sat in the long October grass beside a flat stone next to the most mischievous leprechaun in all of County Galway, and felt, moving through him like the warmth of the 2 coins in his pocket, something he had not felt in 31 years of buying and selling and calculating and reaching. Something that was very close to still. They sat for a while after that, the merchant and the leprechaun, in the long silver grass of Hennigan's field, in the way that 2 people sit, when everything that needed saying has been said, and what remains is simply the sitting. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was, in fact, the most comfortable silence Cormac Doyle had sat in for a very long time. The kind of silence that has weight and warmth and a quality of having been earned. Not the silence of two strangers with nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who have, in the space of a single October evening, said rather more to each other than either of them had entirely intended. Above them, the stars were extraordinary. The kind of stars that appear only when you are far enough from any town and still enough in yourself to actually see them. Not just the bright ones, not just the ones that announce themselves, but all of them, the whole impossible depth of them, layer behind layer behind layer, going back and back and back into a dark so vast and so complete that looking at it like falling. Cormac looked at them for exactly long enough, and then looked back at the field. Flannery had picked up his shoe again and was examining the sole with the critical attention of a craftsman who will not declare a thing finished until he is entirely, not personally, and unconditionally satisfied. "Is it fixed?" said Cormac, nodding at the shoe. Flannery turned it once more, pressed his thumb against a particular point on the sole, listened as if the shoe might answer, and then, with the air of a man conceding a point that has been a long time conceding, nodded. "Finally," said Cormac. "Since March," said Flannery, with the dark satisfaction of a man acknowledging a battle that has gone on considerably longer than it should have. Cormac smiled. He put his hands on his knees and pushed himself to his feet with the slight effort of a man of 50-something rising from long grass in the cold after sitting still for longer than his joints entirely approved of. He looked down at Flannery, still on his flat stone, shoe in hand, hat at its angle, red beard silver-touched now in the starlight. "I should go," he said. "Mossy will be expressing an opinion shortly." "He already is," said Flannery, with the calm certainty of someone who hears a great deal more of the world than most people realize. Cormac reached into his coat pocket and closed his fingers around the two warm coins, feeling their deep and ember-glow warmth against his palm. He thought about what Flannery had said, about what they were, and what they were not, about truth, and solutions, and the thing worth more than gold. He thought briefly about the third coin, about enough. He took his hand out of his pocket and looked at Flannery and said, with the simple directness of a man who has spent an evening being more honest than usual, and found, to his considerable surprise, that he preferred it. "Thank you." Flannery looked up at him, not with the bright, amused eyes of the beginning of the evening, not with the satisfied gleam of a man who has just won his game, with something older than both of those, something that had been there underneath the mischief the whole time, patient and warm and entirely genuine. He nodded. Once. Cormac turned and made his way back across Hennigan's field through the long silver grass toward the gap in the hedgerow. He went through it with rather more dignity than he had managed on the way in, losing nothing to the hawthorn, except perhaps one last small piece of the armour that 31 years of commerce had built around him, and which he found on the other side of the hedge that he did not particularly miss. Mossy turned his large head and regarded Cormac with the expression of a horse who has been waiting in the cold and has formed several opinions about this that he intends to communicate through the medium of pointed silence for the remainder of the journey. "I know," said Cormac. He climbed up onto the cart, settled himself, took the reins, and looked back for just a moment at the hedgerow. Dark and dense and ancient, it gave nothing away. No light, no movement, no sound, except the very faintest, barely there, tap, 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 from somewhere on the other side. Cormac smiled. He clicked his tongue at Mossy, and the cart moved forward on the road that had brought him to nowhere in particular, and turned out to have brought him somewhere rather more important than that. The October night settled around him, cool and clear and thick with stars. The road unwound ahead, pale and unhurried, between the dark hedgerows. The cart creaked in the familiar way it creaked, a sound so constant and so known that it had long since stopped being a sound and become simply the rhythm of being on the road. In his pocket, the 2 coins glowed, warm and steady, against his ribs. He did not count them. He did not calculate their worth. He simply felt them there, warm and present and entirely sufficient, and let the road carry him forward into the dark. Behind him, in Hennigan's field, the flat stone sat empty in the starlight. The long grass moved, in whatever current moved it, slow and silver and entirely unbothered. The mushrooms stood in their pale rings near the far wall as they had stood, and would stand for reasons entirely their own. And somewhere in that quiet and ancient field, a small and private smile lingered in the dark for a while, long after Flannery Moss had gone. Sleep now. The road goes on. And somewhere out there, on every old and wandering road, between every ancient hedgerow, in every neglected October field, the tapping continues.